Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 14, verse 1 and verses 7 through 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Well, few names that are important to me in my life. Francis Wagner, Betty Sider, Sergeant Milt Mautner. Now, who are these people? Mrs. Wagner was my first grade teacher. Betty Sider, Mrs. Sider was my fourth grade teacher. And Sergeant Mautner was one of my instructors in ROTC in high school. And I remember these names, and these names are really important to me because these were people who helped form me. These were people who gave me lessons, and I think back often to the things that they said, the things that they made me believe about myself that I could do. I still remember Mrs. Wagner. I mean, this is a different era, okay? I mean, I'm old enough that it was like a different time. I mean, I went to public schools. I didn't go to like some private school. I went to nothing but Chicago public school. So this wasn't a suburb or anything like that. I mean, I remember a friend of mine in college, someone asked him where he went to high school, and he said, I went to a public school in a private town. Okay, and I thought that was a great answer, but it described some of the environments. But I did not. I went to city of Chicago public schools for grade school and high school, and yet it was a different era. And I remember Mrs. Wagner asked to come over and have dinner at our house. And she came over, so instead of going there, she had dinner with my parents, and she was just encouraging my parents to make sure that I had appropriate educational opportunities because she thought I had some potential. And so I just remember that a lot. And she was already close to retirement at that point in her career, so obviously at this point she has long since gone to be with the Lord. But I remember that so vividly from the first grade, okay? And then Mrs. Sider in a new school that I'd gone to just helped me out there so much and was really the first person to tell me that I could really achieve what things that I wanted to achieve. And Sergeant Mautner taught me so much about leadership. He taught me about what it was like in the real world. He was a combat veteran from Vietnam, had suffered a lot, and he was telling me the difference between perceptions of how leaders are versus what it actually takes to lead people in real life. Because, the one thing about the military, which is always the most fascinating thing, is that the military has excelled in teaching leaders how to lead. Because military leaders are people who are able to convince people to walk toward people who are shooting at them. Okay? This is a difficult task, all right? And so they do such an amazing job, and they left such an imprint. But the thing that I think about when I think about them is I wonder for each of you, who's on your list? Who invested in you? Who in your life are the people that would make that short list You know, the ones who noticed something in you, who helped convince you that you could become something that you would become, who pointed the way, whose lessons you remember, all right? Who has taken the time in your life to invest in you? And then why? Generally, they do it because they noticed, all right? You're not going to invest in anybody if you haven't noticed something about them. And so the first skill that it takes in order to be a person who would do that, all right, is that you notice who's around you and you notice what they're good at. And noticing is one of the things that happens in this passage. I mean, see, there's two kinds of ways you can notice people. And in this passage, it begins with Jesus having been invited to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal, and says they were watching him closely. But we know from the story, they were not watching in a good way. They were watching him closely. Because remember, the previous story we had just had was him healing on the Sabbath, okay? And people were upset. So they're watching him closely. They're watching for the violation. And there are some people who watch us closely, and they are watching for how we're going to mess up. They are watching for what we're going to do incorrectly, all right? But Jesus is also watching, okay? It says, turns around, it's this little wordplay here. It says, when he noticed, so he's noticing also. And he's noticing what they're doing, and he's noticing how they behave. And he was noticing that they were placing a great deal of emphasis on who occupied the place of honor at a table. And that's something, you know, these days, formal etiquette has kind of receded in our consciousness, so it's not quite the same as it used to be, and so there's much more of an emphasis nowadays. Much less of an emphasis nowadays of where people sit. Okay, I don't know when's the last time. It's been a while since I was at any kind of party where there were designated seats, as opposed to just here's a table, here's a bunch of chairs, grab a chair. Okay, but you know, there used to be a really formal setup of where it is that people would sit. And, you know, sometimes it was informal in our homes, right, where dad or mom would sit at the table was often pretty much designated. But in that society, there was a very clear hierarchy for the way seats were arranged at a table. And so people were jockeying to be in the seats that were the seats of the highest honor. And Jesus is noticing their desire to be in a place of honor, and so he tells them a story. Now, notice that it says he told them a parable, and that is something that the narrator is putting into the story, right? I mean, Jesus doesn't say, let me tell you a parable, all right? It's the person who's writing the gospel who says that what Jesus told them next wasn't literal, that what Jesus told them next was a parable. It was a story with a moral connotation, all right? So that's the person who's writing this story down, who is characterizing what Jesus says as a parable. And so he tells them a parable about people at a dinner where people who go to the highest place get embarrassed when the host comes over and says, excuse me, you are in the wrong place. You need to move down. Or people who sit at the lowest place and then have the honor of having the host come and tell them to move up. And all through this story is this juxtaposition of the concept of what is low and what is high. All right? It's all about about the high becoming low, about the low becoming high. And he says, you know what? You are so worried about being high. All right? And we have this all the time. We have this in our society because we use phrases like that. You know, climbing the ladder of success. All right? You should climb the ladder. You should strive for that next rung on the ladder. All right? So we use a lot of that kind of imagery and a lot of that kind of exhortation of telling people to try and reach higher. The problem is that when we do so, one of the questions is, who are we climbing over? All right? Who are we climbing over? Who are we leaving behind? When we race to be high, who are we getting past in order to do that? And that's what Jesus is pointing out here. It's like, when you go for that highest place at the table, you are implicitly pushing other people down. And when you go for the lowest place at the table, you are allowing everyone else to be higher. Okay? And he says the ultimate is when you start inviting people who have no ability to repay. Right? So he segues into this next instruction where he says, look, and you're even inviting people to your banquets because of what they can do for you. You're inviting people to banquets who can repay you. You're inviting people to banquets, all right, who will make you look better, is sort of the implication of that instruction. But he says instead, have a banquet where you invite people who wouldn't be the guests of honor. Invite the people to your banquet who don't even make the lowest spot at most tables. Okay? Because, you've got the people at the highest point in the table and you've got the people at the lowest point in the table. What about the people who didn't even get a seat at the table at all? Okay? What about the people who weren't even invited into the house at all? And Jesus says, you got to be bringing people into the house, giving people a seat at the table who didn't even have that much. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Invite the people who aren't even at the table to the table. And then I imagine that his previous instruction would still apply. Invite the poor, invite the people who aren't even invited to the table, and then when they get to the table, what do? You still take the lowest seat. Invite the people to the table who don't have a seat at the table, and then still yourself take the lowest seat. And that is the thing that is honorable. That is the thing that is honorable. You will be blessed because they cannot repay you, right? You will be blessed because they have no ability to repay you in this life. And that's a tremendous blessing. See, because I think about Mrs. Wagner, Mrs. Sider, Sergeant Mautner. I can't repay them. They've all gone to be with the Lord a long time ago. And in fact, they had probably gone to be with the Lord before I even realized what an impact they had on my life. Okay? Because I assure you that when I'm in the first grade, I am not thinking about whether I'm going to remember my first grade teacher when I'm in my late 50s. Okay? When I was in high school, I was not thinking about whether I would remember and apply the lessons that Sergeant Mautner was teaching me 30 years later, 40 years later, in a completely different career, in a completely different setting. I wasn't thinking that. They'd long gone to be with the Lord, and I can't repay them. But still, what they did was amazing. And so one of my questions to you is, who can you invest yourself in? Yeah. Instead of thinking about how I'm going to get to the highest seat of the table, how can you take the lowest seat, but do so in a way that you are elevating others? Who can you invest yourself in? And maybe, the only way you come to this answer is by beginning to notice more about the people around you. Remember, I said they noticed something, and so they invested in me. All right? Maybe there are people around you that you could be investing yourself in. And the first step is to just notice that they're there. All right? The first step is to just look around you, look in your life and say, who around me is someone that I can be investing in? Right? See, it's so often difficult to notice folks. In fact, even this weekend, right? This weekend is Labor Day weekend. Labor Day. It's not CEO Day. Okay? Yet we hear about the CEOs, we hear about them, we hear about the leaders, and we don't hear enough about the workers. So we have to create a holiday. And we create a holiday called Labor Day to make it clear who we're trying to notice and who we're trying to remember. We're trying to remember the people at the bottom. We're trying to remember the people who do the work. We're trying to remember the people who are digging the coal in the coal mines. We're trying to remember the people who drive the trucks. We're trying to remember the people who are working that assembly line in the factories. We're trying to remember the people, so many people are going to be away this weekend, and we're trying to remember that housekeeper who's working the holiday weekend to make up the beds in the rooms people are staying in. Trying to notice them, and then try to wonder, how can we invest in them to help them become more of who they aspire to be? And when we do that, that's when we find something really special for ourselves in our lives. I mean, Jesus had said this. He said, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled. All who raise themselves up will be lowered," is literally what that means. And those who lower themselves will be raised up. Those who lower themselves to notice people around them who can be lifted up and devote ourselves to lifting them up rather than lifting ourselves up, we will be lifted up in that process. So remember at the beginning of the message, I asked you to take a second and just think about who your list is. Who are the people who helped form you, who helped you become the people that you have become? And I hope that you came up with some names. I hope that somehow maybe you think about that question after service. I know it's unusual to think about a sermon after the service has ended, but if that happens to happen, okay, that you would think about that, and that maybe somewhere in there a smile comes to your face because you remember somebody that maybe you haven't thought about in a while. All right. But then I want to ask you to ask yourself one other question for yourselves going forward in life, and it's this. Whose list will you be on? Whose list will you be on? That someday when when people out there are reviewing the lists of people who helped them become who they are, who are remembering the things that have helped them get through life, who rely on that one little teaching in a tough time to say, so-and-so always told me this, and they call on that. And they go, I've always remembered that, and that person has always been with me because of that. Whose list will you be on? Because that, I think, is success. That, I think, is the exaltation that means something for our lives. That's what matters. That's what counts, is that at the end of the day, there are people we've left behind. And maybe, as in the case of the people of my list, maybe it comes long after we've gone to be with the Lord. And maybe we never know that we were on their list. But to be on someone's list of people who formed them, helped them, where we mentored them, and they remembered that always, that I think is the definition of greatness. The definition of being someone who has lived a life that is worthy of honor. That's the seat at the table that we would want to have. Amen.